The whole point of cities is to connect people with the people and resources they need to thrive. That's why when many people in cities report feeling lonely and maybe even trapped, it just might be an urban design problem. As a permaculture urbanist, I'll share the one rule from ecology that cities must focus on to thrive, plus 46 design elements in 6 categories that cities can use to cure the loneliness epidemic. Welcome to Edenicity, best practices for sustainably abundant cities. Here's that rule from ecology. Ecological and economic abundance is based on sharing. Now, I know if you come from an economics background, you're probably thinking that it's based on exchange, but really that is sharing, as we'll see, in a much more limited set of rules. In nature, you can look at the wealth of an ecosystem in terms of how much life thrives in it. In a desert, life is clearly impoverished. But what is it about life that makes it impoverished in a desert? It's not merely lack of water, and certainly there's no shortage of sunlight, and in many cases no shortage of nutrients. What's going on in a desert is that all of those flows of useful things that come into the desert usually leave without going through a single living thing. But a rainforest, by contrast, is layered. Every ray of sunlight, every drop of rain goes through multiple living beings before that energy or that resource leaves the system. The rainforest is richer because it shares those resources. Therefore, if a city is to take its cues from ecology and attempt to make itself richer, it needs to structure itself for better sharing. This builds wealth, trust, and, of course, better relationships. Now, I admit that's pretty abstract, so the real question is, what exactly should cities build? And here we come to the 6 publics that form my categories of what to build. Pro tip, a city needs to attend to all 6 publics to become a significantly less lonely place. Let's start with the first public, which is obviously public spaces. We need these for people to be able to share the world with each other in real life. These spaces should be built for planned and spontaneous activities. Couple more pro tips. There's a lot to be gained from focusing on parks rather than parking, and this is even more true at the scale of entire cities. This is a picture from cul-de-sac homes in Tempe, Arizona, the very first zoned car-free neighborhood in the U.S. in over 70 years. Having toured the facility myself, I can tell you the architect really got it, but cities should not take for granted that architects are going to understand how people interact with public spaces, and they should make good use of sociological data as described in Charles Montgomery's book, Happy City, and in many prior episodes on this channel. As you can imagine, there's probably hundreds of examples of public spaces, but the ones that stood out in my mind were ballparks, beaches, bikeways, climbing walls, canals, creeks, farmers markets, fields, fishing lakes, fountains, gardens. Gardens could be all season, they could be edible, they could be rock gardens, ornamental gardens. There's just such a variety. Pictured here is the Franklin Park Conservatory near where I used to live in Columbus. Parks, piazzas, squares, playgrounds, pools, hopefully with water slides, and of course managed woodlands. But by themselves, public spaces can be difficult to stay in for long periods of time unless cities attend to the next public, and that is public amenities. These make public spaces more convenient and enjoyable. For example, benches, plantings, restrooms. Pictured here is a slide from Demi Lee's amazing recent video comparing the public restrooms in Japan to those in the United States. Definitely worth your while. See the link in the description below. And for my final example on amenities, Columbus, are you listening? Water fountains. When I was looking for apartments in Columbus, I think I rode about 60 kilometers, that's about 40 miles, on my bike looking at apartments and neighborhoods. Of course, I packed a big water bottle, but it was a hot day and I knew that I would need a refill. So I had planned the route through several public parks. Unfortunately, in Columbus, there just were not any public water fountains to be found at any of the parks. So as a public service, Columbus, are you watching? These aren't really that expensive. They do make some frost-proof, all-season water fountains. Check it out. I put a link in the description. Please consider adding these to the parks. They don't cost too much. Okay, so your city has public spaces with good amenities. What's next? Well, here are a few plantings near where I used to live in Columbus, and you can see that the trees are just filled with berries. These are actually June berries. Of course, you can probably guess the month I took this picture. They're in the same family as blueberries and cranberries, and taste sort of midway between the two. Even though these were just dropping all over people's cars and sidewalks and making a mess up and down the block, and I went out there every morning to collect them for my oatmeal and for pies and things like that, I could never, in several years, interest any of my neighbors in trying a single one of these. And that's because, as just some random guy on the street, I lacked the authority to educate them in what these were. And that brings us to our third public, which is public programs. These build knowledge, ownership, respect, and trust in public spaces and in public resources like we saw with the Juneberries. Now, a couple of pro tips. It's a really good idea to partner early with local civic and charitable groups. For example, when I lived in LA around the turn of the millennium, the 20s and 30s singles section of the Sierra Club was just the best place to be. I mean, I had the most fun. There were all kinds of events. It was a very active group in the day. Pro tip for anybody moving to a city, of course, is to Google around for what's happening and show up for events. The Sierra Club took really good advantage of the many trails available within and around the city of Los Angeles. And I just made friends all over the city. It was just wonderful. But the second pro tip is maybe even more important, which is that cities should train event leaders to encourage introductions and participation. Back when I used to teach college, I was surprised to discover that there were students who could go a whole semester without learning a single name in their classroom. So my second quarter teaching, the very first thing I did on the first day of class was to break people into groups of 2 or 3, have them introduce themselves to each other, work on a really easy question together, and then report back to the class. When I did this, even in a 70-student class, I found that by the end of the quarter, every single student had at one point or another raised their hand and asked a question. So by breaking the anonymity barrier, I also broke the participation barrier. It's a really easy thing to train leaders to do this when they run public programs. Some examples of public programs, of course, would be field trips, tours, classes, festivals, apprenticeships, and even employment in public works, the arts, and landscapes. This would be productive landscapes, historic landscapes, natural or naturalized landscapes. And then, of course, cities all over the world have their own city sports leagues. These are all really great ways to meet people, and cities can play a huge role in making them happen. But in order for these events to happen, people need to be able to access them. That brings us to our next public access. This would be in the form of rail, trams, buses, walkways, and bikeways, all of which are 6 to 30 times higher lane capacity than streets serving cars. This is really important because when we start to focus on public transit as well as active transit, that's walking and bicycling, we can now build denser without any additional feeling of crowding. In fact, far less crowding because people are dealing with that much less vehicular traffic. And this increases walkability. The other thing to note is that public transit is 20 to 50 times safer per passenger mile than cars. This means that people will arrive with less legitimate fear and stress, lifting people's mood and making it much easier for people to be there for each other. Public transit also gives people practice sharing a public resource, the bus, the tram, the train, and overall I've observed it leads to better behavior. Better behavior translates to a safer environment in terms of crime. As I mentioned a couple episodes ago, I've never encountered any crime on a bus, but I have encountered a lot of crime, and in my extended family, quite a bit of crime in cars. And I think that's true of most people that I've met. And finally, unlike a car, buses are accessible to people of a much wider range of ages. You don't need to get a license to ride a bus. I started riding buses from the age of 10 by myself. This makes public transit much more welcoming to a much broader swath of society. Obviously, where people feel more welcome, they're likely to feel less lonely. The next public is public housing. And the pro tip there is don't build it cheap. If you build it cheap, then it's housing of last resort, and what happens is you end up with bad neighborhoods. That's also a problem because now when people show up to public events, you're not sure literally where they're coming from, and there's less trust. Vienna has been building social housing for over 100 years now. In Vienna, 60% of the population lives in social housing. It is no coincidence that it is the #1 most livable city in Europe. Singapore made public housing a deliberate wealth-building strategy. Back when it was desperately poor, and beset with slums, fires, and race riots, as I reported in my book, Housing in Four Cities, available in the links below. In Singapore, between 88 and 91% live in public housing. And again, I've had people approach me and say, well, look, Singapore is an exception. It's a rich country. But in fact, it was not rich when it began this project, and it began this project specifically to improve its economic outlook. And in both cases, this is high amenity housing. It is anything but cheap. This was a massive public investment, but it paid off. Vienna is the #1 most livable city in the world. And as of 2012, 1 out of 6 Singaporeans was a cash millionaire, not counting the value of their home. Now, if you're serious about having no bad neighborhoods, then you must attend to the 6th public good, and that is public schools. No bad neighborhoods, especially in the United States. It's the same as having no bad school districts. The idea here is that a common, high-quality education builds trust and a shared identity. This is really important because, as Oxford professor Robin Dunbar has pointed out, our brains are really not wired to handle more than about 150 relationships directly. And so if we want to live in a society where we're not fragmented into really tiny groups, we need to have little cues that the people that we're meeting day to day are people who will cooperate rather than compete with us. That is to say, we need common experiences, common languages, customs that we understand and follow in order to have a society of people that trust each other. In Finland, there's one educational system, and the outcomes are great. Singapore too, actually. But in the United States, as painfully pointed out by the New York Times a couple of years back, most states and counties have opted for small school districts that route the tax monies from small neighborhoods directly into the schools. This creates enormous pressure on people to try to live in a neighborhood that's got good schools, which then creates an upward pressure on price and leads to this runaway process where the richer neighborhoods have really excellent schools and the poorer neighborhoods end up with schools that have mold and inadequate heating and cooling. Just basically wildly different experiences, sometimes within a few blocks of each other. In such a situation, people get wildly different educations depending on where they live, and you can bet that people have very little trust in one another. So the painful truth in the United States, in any case, is we can't separate public schooling from having good quality neighborhoods. So the 5th and 6th of these public goods are really part of the full picture. All right, here's a quick summary for people who like to take screenshots. The 6 publics include public spaces to be with people in real life, public amenities that make public spaces more convenient and enjoyable, public programs that bring people together to interact and build a sense of belonging, public access, including public transit, that makes public places closer, safer, and more welcoming and affordable for people, public housing, which, as we saw in the case of Singapore and Vienna, deals more people into the economy. The more people who feel financially at least a little bit freer, the more free people feel to go to events and hang out with friends and be sociable. And finally, public schooling in a flat funding model where you get the same education no matter where you live creates a shared identity, and that in turn creates a high trust society, all of which helps to combat loneliness. All right, next time I'll talk briefly about how neighborhoods can redesign themselves to cure the loneliness epidemic. Here are those 2 playlists I promised. And thanks as always to the wonderful patrons who are helping to financially support this channel and make it all happen. Take care, stay green, see you next time.